Attar was one of the most famous of the Sufi poets. His greatest writing was called, or is called, The Conference of the Birds. And if you've never read it, it's something that we should in our lifetime imbibe. It's one of the greatest spiritual allegories of all time. But Attar's teacher and master was Omar Khayyam. We know Omar Khayyam because of his rubaiyat. But Omar Khayyam was a famous mathematician and astrologer. But his occupation was that of a tent maker. Now Attar tells the story about how he went on pilgrimage to visit his master, Omar Khayyam. And he tells it, of course, in very beautiful poetic terms. But paraphrasing this story, Attar arrives at the city where Omar Khayyam lives, and he's surrounded by the cacophony of the sounds of the town square as people go about their business. And then suddenly the call to prayer is heard, and instead of the discordance of sounds, there's all the different cadences of those who are saying, God is great, God is great, God is great. And so Attar describes how he followed the throng of people as they made their way to the mosque. And then all was silent in the town square as all bent in prayer. But Attar says that he looked around for his master and he was nowhere to be seen. So after the prayers in the mosque had been completed, he asked one of the imams where he might find his master. And the imam said, "Oh, that heretic, you never see him in the mosque. You'll find his shop in the far corner of the town square." So Attar describes how he made his way to his master's shop. And there he saw him, bending over the piece of cloth that was making the tent that he was working on. His long white hair and his white beard covering what was a serene and radiant countenance. Attar describes how he bent down and took his master's hands and kissed them. And then his master took his head in his hands and kissed him on the forehead. After this, he describes how his master reached over and took his book of poetry and opened it at a page and read. And I paraphrase because the poetry is so beautiful. Would that we could take the web of human suffering and bend it to our will. Just then, Attar describes that the evening was coming down, and a shadow suddenly fell on his master's face, putting half of it in dark and the other half in light. And then, still in an ecstatic mood, Omar Khayyam repeats the final line of his piece of poetry. The wish that we could bend the will. So after an exchange, Attar takes his leave from his master. But then before he leaves, he asks his master, "What is your will?" And Omar Khayyam says, "I wish that when I die, that the petals of the blossoms of a flowering tree will cover my resting place." Some years later, Attar made another pilgrimage to his master's city, but his master had died. And he asked, where was his grave? And it was told to him, "Oh, that heretic could not be buried amongst the believers. He's buried over there." So Attar went to find his master's grave. It was beneath a bower of cherry trees. And at the time that he arrived, the blossoms were being blown by the north wind, and there over his master's grave was a carpet of white petals. And there's a story about a king. He was somewhat enlightened, and he decided that he would test his people. So he sent out an edict that they could come to his palace and take whatever it was that their heart desired. So a great throng came throughout the day, and they took the golden goblets, they took the paintings off the walls, they took the tiles from the floors. And as the day passed, the king's heart got heavier and heavier, until finally all was gone. The coffers were empty. The palace walls were denuded. But when the king looked up, there was one young man remaining. And being in a rather disgruntled state, the king said, "What do you want?" The young man said, "I want to be your friend." The courtiers who were standing around the king laughed and said, "Ha, you just want to take advantage of everything that the king has." "No," said the young man, "I do not want anything from my king. I just want to be his friend." With tears in his eyes, the king stepped down from his throne and embraced the young man. Thirdly, there's the story of that seeker after truth and enlightenment. And he heard that there was a king who, at certain times unknown to the populace, would open the door, the gate in the walls of his palace to fulfill the wish of whoever stood there. So the young man made his way to this palace, and he came to the gate in the wall, and he stood and waited. But, as we know, hunger, thirst, the elements, the rain, the wind came, and people passed, and they saw him standing there, and the water seller would give him a cup of water, and the old bread maker gave him a bun now and then. But as the days passed, and as is the usual way, people began to speak to him, tell him of their lives and their troubles, and he would listen. What else was there for him to do? He was waiting. And then it was found that the words of consolation, comfort that he was able to bring changed people's lives. So more and more came. So on a given day there would be a crowd standing around him as he stood. Then one day, suddenly, he heard the sound of keys being turned. A great latch, grinding open. And he knew that the gate was being opened behind him. But then he looked out, and he saw all those who were arrayed waiting. And he stood, and the grinding of the door as it closed caused a thud, and the sound of the lock, the latch being returned, and the keys as they turned echoed in his ears. He went about his listening and speaking to those who gathered around him. It's asked of you, what is the thread that you recognize that runs through these three simple stories? Even now, as we recognize from this Easter energy the inevitability of the stone rolling aside and there emerging something new, And yet there is still life. What is the thread that runs through these three stories that we can recognize, even while we become accustomed to that which has emerged after the stone rolls aside? I'm not as I was before, but I still have this body. I still have this mind. I still have my tendencies, my idiosyncrasies, my vices even. What's the thread that runs through these stories? What remains when all else is gone? Thank you.